Good. Pnawn da. Good afternoon, everybody. This session is about science, particularly science in Wales. My name's Chris Lee. I head the land, nature, forestry, and I lead on science and evidence within the Welsh Government. And my particular context for this science session is that I think we really need to think about really what is the impact of science on the lives of people, both today and future generations. So if we keep that in mind, and in terms of that, what is the real contribution that science makes within sustainable development, but particularly to economic growth? And that's something else that I think we need to think about. So we really need to think about long term, but what are going to be the benefits for people and for improving people's lives? With that in mind, going back to ecosystems, I'm very pleased to introduce to you, those who were in the last session would know that Bridget Emmett is here. Who better than Bridget to talk to us about ecosystem services, having a lot of expertise here at Bangor, working with the Centre of Ecology and Hydrology, but having that expertise in soils, water, and how these services fit together. So, Bridget, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Well, I've been given the very challenging title of trying to encapsulate ecosystem research in Wales, and it is an impossible task. And I'm going to try and give you a flavour of where we've come from and perhaps more excitingly where we're going to. My co-authors up here are people who've been kind enough to send me slides or who are major players in some of the projects that I'm going to share with you. And it's as I'm going to hopefully show, Wales is a very connected nation. So I'm trying not to give a little Wales idea. We've been heavily involved in the NEA. You can see one of my co-authors comes from New Zealand. And I think that is as it should be. And I'm not trying to just highlight what we do in isolation. Why does Wales need ecosystem research? Well, the policy people are over there, so I'm going to tell you some of the things that you did hear this morning, but perhaps a little bit more, just to say why it is we think the policy people need us. Wales is one of the very few countries that actually have sustainable development written into its constitution. It takes it very, very seriously, and it has to deliver it. And in that, Welsh Government recognises that the environment has an intrinsic value, and that it's has a central role in delivering its commitment to sustainable development. Now, Wales, as we've heard this morning, this afternoon, is not alone in wanting to achieve this. One of the things I actually haven't heard about today, I don't think, is the IPBES initiative, where they've taken very much on board the decline in biodiversity, the need to keep our ecosystems functioning for us and delivering those services we need. And for that, IPBES is an international platform, and they have particularly highlighted these three statements that I've pulled out because it's particularly relevant for people working in the science research. They want scientific credibility and independent information. And I think that's it, credible and independent. And that also takes account of the complex relationships between biodiversity, ecosystem services, and people. Need effective methods, and also, and I think we heard this from Steve and Roy, we need that communication. The more any of us get involved with policy and people, managers on the ground, the more we realise we're not doing the right science, we're not encapsulating in the right way such that it's actually useful. So what are the challenges for scientists? I think we've heard these questions at various points from speakers throughout the day. So for example, the Natural Capital Initiative or Natural Capital Committee in London now is trying to identify, it reports directly to the Vice Chancellor of the Exchequer, and in Wales as well, we need to think about what metrics actually capture how much we have of this natural capital. What metrics do we use to articulate and quantify the condition and, perhaps more importantly, the resilience for the future? If you have an asset, that means something that you think you might need for the future. You don't quite know what for, and you don't know when, and that's why we need to know about resilience. What ecosystem properties confer that resilience to a system? We've heard the next one before quite frequently. What's the link between biodiversity and ecosystem services? And then we've got the whole thing of thinking beyond biodiversity as species richness and genetic diversity to landscape diversity. Where does it matter where things are in the landscape? This whole issue of spatial pattern. And anyway, we've got to then link it back to people, cost, economics, and I don't mention social here. On the right-hand side, you see a GB study, but that was also done for Wales as well. So forgive me not showing the Welsh one, but this is where we've taken 601 kilometre squares all across GB. and looked at what is the convergence of different ecosystem properties. And these you can link to particular services in some cases. So soil carbon storage, climate regulation, primary production. And what you can see as you go, and hopefully this arrow will work, yep. As you go from high ecosystem to low productivity, what we find is this is the first axis that comes out in this analysis. So this is a completely objective way of going, if you just look at what things align together, what's the best predictor of things that, if you like, reduce variation, that pull things apart? And productivity actually seems to be the best relationship, and then you basically have your arable, highly productive systems over here, your peatlands here, and a very classic biodiversity hump in the middle. And what was really nice in this, using exactly the same spatial methods, it's an integrated monitoring program that measures all these things at the same time, it's called Countryside Survey, you can see that we can look at the relationship with habitat diversity to pollinators, even to soil biodiversity. And someone, I think it was Steve, was emphasizing that we know very little, but actually, if you go onto the NERC Soils portal, you can download a UK map of soil biodiversity. We think that's a first. But there's really interesting relationships here, and what we need to do is unpick and know at what point do they change, at what spatial, when you go to a catchment or even a farm, when and where do these relationships break down? We can't have everything because ecologically they do not occur in the same place in the same way. So a few examples of our huge, extensive research. I do apologize. I'm going to give you a bit of a flavor. The ones I know well, I tried to capture ones that do reflect the HEIs across Wales, plus ourselves, which is a public research organisation. So the first is one that I do know very well, and it's one of our oldest. It's the Plum Lemon catchment, and we might think ecosystem services is new, but actually, this was a study set up 40 years ago to look at the trade-off between fibre production, and it was really based on wood security. After the war, they wanted to know that we would produce enough wood. Massive afforestation of the uplands. Water companies then said, what's the impact going to be on our reservoirs? Water yield. Trees use more water, don't they? Well, and everyone argued. And so they set up this paired catchment study to prove it. And it was an incredibly brave thing to do because trees grow very slowly. So they set it up, and it's the first catchment skill study of effects of land cover and water budget. There was lots of theoretical models, and globally, Plum Lemon is well known for being one of the preeminent studies that basically tested those models. Huge number of books, nature papers, great science. The answer, 25% reduction in water yield during the active growing phase. So it's very rare you can actually say the answer in one number, but there you go. But actually, it was the wrong question. What the big issue out of Plum Lemon was water quality. Massive interaction between air quality and trees. Trees are just great scavengers of air pollution. Huge impact in terms of acidification of water. Never mind about when they went and felled the trees. So it had a huge influence. So it did feed back. So I think Roy was challenging us somewhat. When does it feed back? When does it actually influence decisions? Plum Lemon, an example, actually changed the forest and water guidelines. But now, that was then. Where are we going now? It's now a Global Critical Zone Observatory in the EU Soil Trek project, and it's also an EU Ecosystem Observatory. So we're recognizing that 2 services aren't enough. We have to go beyond that. And also, it's become part of a much bigger kind of living landscape. A lot of the charities and NGOs have taken Plum Lemon, part of a bigger initiative to really look at how people explore and use and value these upland landscapes. The next project I'd like to just share is the Duress project run by Isabel Durance at Cardiff University. They focused on 3 ecosystem services, so we're going up, one each time. This time it's birds, a cultural value, fish for anglers, recreation, and water supply. They're doing fundamental science to look at how biodiversity basically underpins these 3 services, right the way from energy capture and photosynthesis, right the way through to the invertebrates, going to the fish, going to the birds, and also clean water. What is the relationship between, on the x-axis, the biodiversity from gene to food web versus the ecosystem service? Their thesis is, if they understand that better, we will be able to better inform land and climate managers and changers. It's a huge project, 3.1 million, loads of people in Wales, outside of Wales. Next one is the Turf to Surf project, which is a NERC grant, again, very large, 3.2 million, focused in the Conway catchment. And this is all about, we have multiple drivers, climate change, management, air pollution, and they all have an influence through various ways on the carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus cycle. Now, science has been dreadful in some cases of just like land management is put in silos and management is put in silos, we ourselves put our science in silos. So there's carbon scientists and there's nitrogen scientists. Phosphorus tends to be over there somewhere. And pathogens, whoa, way over there. This project is all looking about how these different drivers interact and impact on the carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus cycles and how they are coupled and decoupled with pathogens, and then how they affect three main ecosystem services: water, carbon storage, and biodiversity. And it will all feed into developing a better land-atmosphere model called JULES, which is actually the land-atmosphere model that links up to the Hadley Centre GCM. So doing lots on carbon sequestration, which is a balance between two processes. It all gets very complicated, but yeah, our ecosystems are complicated. We need to understand production, how carbon is fixed, and decomposition, which is how carbon is lost. What's the balance? Modeling, mapping, a whole range of real methods right the way through. Biodiversity, we're doing biodiversity in plants, in the waters, and in the soil. How do they interrelate to, and how do they link to the nutrient cycles I was mentioning? And then water quality, right from the headwater streams right the way through to the estuarine systems. And I've got a red circle to remind me to say there's a big issue about potential trade-offs between increasing food production on the land, but the pathogens and the nutrients that come from that will just impact on our shellfish beds, basically reducing food production and food security in our coastal waters, which for whales is a huge issue. It's one of our major industries, growth industries. We do not want more sheep and cows and dairy to mean less shellfish. That is just not a good holistic approach. The next one is what converts. I was talking about resilience. What converts resilience of our habitats to climate change? Well, we have one of those second longest term climate change experiment in Wales. It's in Clwynog Forest. It's part of a European network called Increase. It's been 15 years of long-term experiments. That's huge. We know that these systems, there's massive lags in hysteresis. So what we're doing is identifying impact, determining mechanisms, and integrating results. The results are really quite surprising. Repeated, very modest drought mean that a fundamental change to soil physical properties in these upland organomineral soils. What that means is nearly every model is wrong, because every model says, what is your soil physical properties? And that's a static, it doesn't change. And what we're showing is that's absolutely wrong. It changes how much soil moisture the systems hold, and that therefore has a positive feedback on carbon emissions. So that's a speedy trawl through a lot of the research. We're incredibly rich. We punch way above our weight in Wales with respect to drawing down money from UK and EU sources for catchment ecosystem research and modelling and what have you. But how do we translate it? How do we make it helpful? So we have to then think about what the policy levers are. 95% of Wales is agricultural forestry land, 5% is urban. So that means any policies that we probably have to play with really have to think about this. There's the Rural Development Plan for Wales and the new land management scheme called Glass Tier that Wales has launched 1 to 2 years ago now. It's a whole farm sustainable land management system, and it's really ambitious. It's not just about biodiversity, it's not just about water, it's about all those things you can see. Climate change, greenhouse gas emissions, water management, maintaining and enhancing landscape and historic landscape, access and recreation, and also woodland. That's a massive task for any scheme to undertake. And the basic question is about 60 to 80 million. It goes up, down, depending on uptake and which scheme you're in and RDP and what have you. But this is the question. This is going to farmers every year to benefit the environment and compensate for reduction. The question is, does it? And that is the job that Welsh Government has given to a team of people involving 13 institutions, 93 co-authors of the first year report that's just gone in. It's called the Glass Tier Monitoring and Evaluation Programme. And it is, what we have developed is an integrated rolling monitoring and evaluation programme that goes hand in hand as they launch the scheme we were launched. So we can get fast iterative feedback to policy to say using models, a rolling monitoring programme, so that it's not the usual, you do your scheme, at the end you assess it and go, ooh, we could have done that better. We're doing it at the same time. Results will be slow to come in, but models are basically hypotheses. We have a framework, we can run them, that's the best understanding of scientific knowledge. So a good part of the first year report has been us running an ensemble of models to say, this is what we think you might get. Do you want to change it? Not up to us. We're the independent scientists. And it literally is incredibly ambitious, just matching the ambition of the scheme. We're doing birds, pollinators, plants, landscape features, historic features, water, soil, social and economic studies from the farmers to the wider community. So, and the point is, this is in one project. So instead of, as before, the poor Welsh Government people got a stack of different reports and they had to sort of go, so in the big scheme of things, what were correlated, how do they work? It's going to be one report that did just land on Chris's people's desks of about 400 pages long, but it's brought together. There is an executive summary. We've done that integration. They don't have to. The data, never mind just about the Rural Development Plan, if you think about the richness of that data, our people in government have to report against a plethora of directives, commitments, and what have you. This is an incredible data-rich source that can help report against a whole list of different directives and commitments. Statistical modelling approaches are absolutely critical. This is not about just putting another data point on a trend line, although of course we do that. One is using the statistical approaches, as I showed you right at the beginning, looking at different spatial scales, really powerful and very rigorous statistical approaches. And the other is to use models, and we're using a whole ensemble of models, and I only have time to tell you about one. This is something called the Lucy model that came out of a model I'm sure you're all, well, I hope some of you heard about, which is the Polyscape model. The Polyscape model was developed by Imperial, Bangor University, CEH, Nottingham, and I think a few others and I've forgotten. It's since been developed, Polyscape still exists and it's doing its thing, and it's since been developed by Beth Jackson to something called the Lucy tool. And here's all the services it currently does. It is not a layer of GIS data. Absolutely not. It's got fundamental processes in there. It does hydrology just as better as any other catchment model, and it's slowly being developed. We're still building it up. The next one is going to be greenhouse gases will go in there, landscape will go in there. We've got species and connectivity in there. So it's basically a tool that lets us look at spatial analysis. It lets us look at trade-offs. So for example, we can look at where is there already existing value for one service. For example, woodland connectivity or flood mitigation. So red is, it's doing great, do not touch it. Okay? Orange is where it's doing not a bad job, and green is where you've got an opportunity to improve service. So it's a very simple communication tool, if you like, front end. And then you can look at trade-offs, and the more that this figure is really to show is the more services you try to layer on top to try and find win-win-wins, the less and less and less you have green, where you can actually do things which will optimize without negating or reducing another service. And we've done some work for DEFRA for one catchment, and we'll be doing this for the whole of Wales. The work is ongoing, where you can basically look at, so their scheme, not Glassetier, was called Environmental Stewardship. And this was an analysis of present-day carbon or future carbon before they even did anything. Right, it was about 199 kilograms of hectare. After they did environmental stewardship, what did Lucy say their carbon was, and what might it go into the future? If they had, this really pleased the DEFRA and Natural England people, because what it showed was that their guys on the ground are actually pretty good at doing this. They know where to put things, but they could have done better. With a spatial explicit tool such as Lucy, they could have actually captured more carbon either for the less money, less area, or they could actually, for the same money, got more outcome. Okay? So you could have gone, but in total, you've increased carbon by doing all the trees they've done in wetlands. You could have got more, though. You could have got more bang for your buck. And that's just for carbon, but actually, of course, what she did was woodlands, connectivity, species, she did water quality, and she even did flood, because that's the benefit. So this is where you see she asked them, what do you most care about? They said carbon and biodiversity. She optimized for them, and then you see what the impacts are on water quality. So that brings you to, that's one model. Is it the best? Do we use it? No idea. So there's a whole lot of work going on comparing which model and which tool, when do you use them, what they're good for, when, where. So we're involved in a study just funded by NERC to compare Invest, Aries and Lucy on the Conway catchment, which is the catchment I was just telling you about. It's got lots of investment to look at coupled macronutrient cycles from source to sea. We're going to look at, for example, how these three models deal with landscape diversity and what the impacts on ecosystem services are. We're not the only people doing that. I'm aware of another study comparing Aries, Invest, and costing nature in sub-Saharan Africa. so that everybody's trying to get their heads around which tools you use when, which are just GIS layers, which actually has process in them so they can actually do scenarios. And globally, there's a meeting in November in New York where the United Nations Statistics Division are testing tools and models to try and move the ITBEST community, all of us, from theory into practice for global baseline assessments of biodiversity and ecosystem assessments. And the models they've chosen to test include Globio, Invest, Aries, MIMES, Nature Index, and, lovely for us, Lucy, which means that these are some of the maps I've nicked out of our first year report. For every 5 metre by 5 metre in Wales, we have run scenarios, we've looked at what the impact of flood, carbon, biodiversity of different interventions is, right from field scale up to catchments, right the way up to the national scale. So Wales seems to be ahead of the game. We've already got global assessments. We're already looking at interventions and what the impacts are on ecosystem services. And the next job in this following year will be looking at the trade-offs, at literally at different scales, right from field sub-level to catchment to national scale. So I just want to leave with a bit of an optimistic. I've been 25 years in this game doing ecosystem science before it became sexy, basically. And this is the first time that I think we all seem to be on the same page. This meeting, I just think has been great. It's a good mix of people. We've got the right people, possibly missing a bit of business, but I think it's really exciting times ahead. So I'll leave you with that. And a thanks to my GMET team, without which that big GMET project, the Glass Tier Monitoring Evaluation Project, would not happen. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bridget. We've got time for 1 or 2 quick questions. One at the back.
You need a mic, don't you?
How does, you mentioned Glass Tier, how does Glass Tier compare to Tier-Gover, the previous agri-environmental scheme? Improvement or what are the differences?
Oh, we're not there yet because Glass Tier is only just starting. We are the independent assessors. Glass Tier, we're first year in. We know that the other schemes are still, quite a lot of people are still in the other schemes and they're coming out and will go in. So, and it would not be for me to comment. I give the evidence base of saying, and we will be doing the comparisons. There was quite a lot of work in the last report concerning past agri-environment schemes. If you haven't seen that report, it's and also a report by Stephen Antony of ADAS, where he actually looked at the impact in diffuse pollution and greenhouse gas from the organic scheme, Tier-Goval, all the others. Makes for very interesting reading. But we haven't got there yet, and I'm not about to say whether I think Glass Tier is better or not. It's not my job.
Okay, just a statement. Less farms are now eligible for Glass Tier than they were under Tier-Goval.
One of the things that we've explored, and I encourage you to look at the first year report when it came out, Welsh Government are quite interested in whether we should do shallow, broad, narrow, deep. Do you get more bang for your buck if you go narrow, deep? So we actually explored some of the interventions that hit a few things hard, do you see what I mean? Or whether you cover it. So one thing would be, say, cover crops, a few arable, and other would be fewer sheep, fewer grazing. And then we've looked at what that would mean in terms of outcome. So I'm trying to emphasize, if you like, that it's about an objective evidence base, that what we're about, and, well, watch this space.
And just quickly, actually, that's not quite true. The scheme is open to all farmers, so it's not an eligibility factor that less farms are eligible.
Criteria are much more reduced.
Okay. Kevin, do you want to say something?
Sorry, just to introduce myself, I'm Kevin Austin, and I am head of the Glass Tier scheme, so I'm the natural person to respond to you. Just so you're aware, after 10 years of running the Tier-Goval scheme, there were 3,500 farmers in the scheme and a waiting list of 900 that we couldn't afford to bring into the scheme. As it stands, by the end of this year, there'll be 4,000 people in Glass Tier after only 3 years. So that immediately counters the first point you made. In terms of whether it would be better or not, obviously I completely agree with Bridget, it's far too soon to say, but I would say that Tier-Goval, there was a lot that was right about it, and I would agree with what Bridget said, which is that we've recently published 3 comprehensive reports looking at biodiversity, water, soil carbon, etc., and what both the Tier-Goval and Tier-Cynwal scheme delivered, and they're available on the Welsh Government internet site, and I'd say check them out. But what you'll see is that the results of the Tier-Goval scheme were mixed, to be honest, and I had a lot to do with the Tiergovel scheme, so I have a vested interest in both schemes. But unfortunately, the Tiergovel scheme was found by those involved with it to fail in many senses, and it wasn't targeted at where we could best deliver environmental goods and services. And where Glastier has been designed to try and improve upon Tiergovel in an incremental way, is to try and aim and our interventions in a better way to where the information, the sort of information models and information that Bridget's been talking about show that we can actually deliver the goods and spend our money in a more effective way. Thank you.
Far more articulate than I could have put it. Thank you, Kevin.
Good. I'm afraid we might get a chance to come back for some more questions if we have a slot later on. But thank you very much, Bridget. Really interesting slot, and we will move on.